Hi, today I want to talk about the philosophy of Hegel, one of the last great system builders. I am going to ignore the warning of some analytic philosophers that one must never finagle with Hegel, there can be no apology for his phenomenology, and instead talk about some of the ideas in his work, The Phenomenology of Spirit, and a number of other works. Especially we're going to focus on Hegel's Dialectic, his way of thinking about the way in which thought is transformed, the dynamics of thought, if you will, the way it changes over time. Logicians tend to think about the logical relations among propositions. What's a premise, what's a conclusion, and so forth. It's a very static picture. Occasionally they talk about how language changes. A logic might try to take into account the fact that sentences are said in sequences building on one another, not merely as sets that all somehow get presented at the same time. But most logical systems abstract away from all of that. Hegel thinks that the most fundamental ideas of logic, however, should have to do with the dynamics of thought, the way in which thought progresses, thought changes. And that's a very different conception. So logicians who pick up Hegel's logic are going to be surprised. They're going to be finding very little that's familiar and a great deal that seems to them very, very strange. It's because Hegel is interested in those dynamic questions, not in the static question of how this proposition relates to that proposition, but instead how people thinking about a problem in a certain way or having a certain kind of view are going to find themselves confronted with things that will then lead them to think about things in a different way. So he's interested in something like the dynamics of thinking, whereas you might say that most logicians are focused on the statics or the kinematics at most of thinking. So Hegel is giving us a very different conception, not just of logic, but of the philosophy of mind, of the nature of the world, than we find in earlier philosophers, and his impact over the last 2 centuries has been immense. Let's begin by recalling some key facts about Kant. Kant's rationalism held that there were innate ideas, pure concepts of the understanding, in his way of presenting it, the categories that were based on the logical functions of judgment. And then there were synthetic a priori truths, or laws of the understanding, things that we used as part of our conceptualization of the world to actually construct the objects of experience. So Kant was a kind of idealist. The objects of experience are things we construct through our own mental activity. We receive information from sensibility, but then that gets processed in a multi-stage process into objects that we synthesize. And so we can know things about them a priori, independently of experience, by understanding that process of synthesis. But all of this applies only within the realm of experience. It applies to things that are being projected, not to the world itself. Hegel has a very different idea. So to think about what he is doing to change the picture, let me draw you a little sketch of what Kant had in mind. Kant's picture, as we've laid it out, is something like this. Kant, let's say, depicts a thought as occurring within a mind that is receiving information in some fashion from sensibility. So here we have sensibility, our faculties of sense, perception, and here out there is something that is generating that, the thing in itself. Noumena is his technical term for that. We relate in a multi-stage process the information coming from sensibility, let's say through this perception, to some concepts here. Maybe some empirical concepts we've derived from experience, maybe from, well, from our a priori concepts of the understanding. And then the mind projects, on the basis of this, an object of experience, the thing that we experience as a triangle. And we take our thought to be about that triangle. But really, it's not a direct line of that triangle affecting us, as in Plato or Aristotle or many earlier philosophers. Instead, this thing is an appearance. It is something that is being constructed. It's an appearance. He also refers to that as an object of experience. He uses the Greek term, this is a phenomenon, this is a noumenon, that is to say, the thing in itself. So in general, the phenomena of experience, the objects of experience, are things that are the product of mental activity. I compared this in my talk about Kant to a projector. The mind is something like a projector, and some information comes into the projector, a digital file, a film strip, something that gives it information about what it is to project, but then it projects something on the screen of experience. And we can know something a priori about the things that will be projected on that screen by knowing something about the projector. But given that we have knowledge of things on the screen, and we are able to have some reflective knowledge of the nature of the projector, what then do we infer about the thing in itself? Well, we have no guarantee that these things will obey the laws of the understanding. They're the inputs. So for example, it might be that everything that can appear on that screen, because we're using a black and white projector, is black and white. That doesn't mean that reality is just black and white, that what goes into it is black and white, that what goes into it has any color at all. For that matter, it could just be a digital file. It might be zeros and ones, or really just electrical impulses that are meant to represent zeros and ones. And so what's getting projected here has no similarity to this at all. So in short, we can infer nothing about the nature of the thing in itself. He refers to this as the unconditioned, equal to X. That is to say, it is unknown. We don't know. Something, he thinks, must be affecting sensibility. It's not just doing this of its own accord. It's not just kind of off on a wild flight of fancy. And after all, different people seem to perceive the same thing at the same time. If you were to walk into this room, you would see chairs, you would see lights, you would see me. And so that needs to be explained. We'll talk about that problem much later. But Kant says all this is reason to think there is a thing in itself. First thing Hegel does is say, wait a minute, I don't think that's doing anything for you. Look, you're saying sensibility is receiving information from the thing in itself, the noumenal world. And then this is all taking place, and we can know about this part, we can know about this part, we can deduce something about all of this, even a priori. Good, with you with all that. But now what role exactly is this playing? You can't officially even say this exists, or that it's causing us to perceive things in any way, because causation and existence are some of the categories. You know they apply to the things out here, you have no reason for thinking they apply here. Maybe they do. I mean, you can't rule it out on the basis of what you said. But in short, the thing in itself is playing no role in the theory. It is doing nothing for you, okay? It's sitting around like an independent wheel, or like an appendix, you might say, in a human body, where maybe it's good for something, but it doesn't seem like it's good for anything. So Hegel says, first of all, get rid of that. It accomplishes nothing in this theory. We end up having some weird thing there, and we say, but we can't say anything about it, we don't know what's going on. In short, it's just like substance in Locke, from Berkeley's point of view, for example, or from Hume's point of view. You end up saying, well, there must be something I know not what in which these qualities inhere that makes this all hang together as an object. Well, what is it, says Berkeley? Something you know not what? That's no theory of anything. Just get rid of it. You don't need it. There are just a bunch of qualities here, right? You say, no, they're in something. They're in something. What? I don't know. I mean, Berkeley's in effect saying, that's no theory. Get rid of it. It's doing no theoretical work for you at all. And Hegel says the same thing to Kant here. He says, okay, so all of this process rests ultimately on a thing in itself that is doing something I know not what, and has something I know not what character that enables it to do whatever I don't know what it's doing. And in short, he says that just explains nothing. Get rid of it. It's not doing any work. It explains nothing, whatever. But the second thing he does is to say, okay, you're getting something a priori here, and you've got these laws of the understanding, the a priori concepts. Well, all right, there are empirical things like triangle, but then there's all this stuff here that you claim is a priori. And you say from that, you can get universal knowledge, you can get necessary knowledge. Well, Hegel says, that's going to be true only if we all have exactly the same a priori concepts of the understanding. Only if the same laws of the understanding operate for everybody, every human being, in every culture, every time, every place. Why should we think any of that is true? Why should we believe that all of us share the same a priori concepts, that all of us share the same laws of the understanding, all of us approach experience in the same way and have our minds function in the same way? Hegel says, I don't see why that should be true at all. So Hegel thinks about these categories, these concepts of the understanding and the laws of the understanding, and says, why should they be constant and invariable? Why do they have to be universal, all human beings, all times, all places? That doesn't seem right. We're going to get universal and necessary knowledge of the world only if all of that is constant, the same for all people, all times, all places, all circumstances, all societies, all cultures, all historical periods, etc. But there's no reason to expect that. Why should we expect human beings to construct the world in the same way at all times and places, all circumstances, all cultures? Think about somebody seeing the world as a resident of ancient Egypt. Apparently they saw the world as two-dimensional. That's a joke. Or someone who is a resident of a medieval village. Or someone living in the midst of the Kalahari Desert. Or modern-day Manhattan. Why should all of these people construct the world in the same way? Why should they all approach it with the same set of concepts? Now, of course, they're going to have different concepts coming in from experience, but Hegel doesn't just mean that. Why should we assume they have all the same starting points at the outset? So, Hegel says, I'm a historicist. What does that mean? The way we construct the world develops over time. Philosophy and these a priori concepts, these laws of the understanding, they vary with historical circumstances. The famous quotation here is, philosophy is its own time raised to the level of thought. Hegel says, tell me what an ancient Egyptian said in philosophy, or what an ancient Greek said, or a medieval villager said, or a resident of the modern-day United States says. I'll tell you, those are the cultural assumptions. Those are the assumptions, the concepts they're bringing to understanding the world. Are they all identical? No. There are some overlap. I mean, it would be surprising, given that they're all human beings who face basic human problems, if there were no overlap at all. Of course there's overlap. And you might try to find that overlap as, aha, that's the true universal necessary a priori thing, which I think is Kant's attitude. But Hegel says, I'm not so sure about that. It might be that just that set of people in that set of circumstances, historically developing, have that set of concepts. Now, go study the people in the Kalahari Desert. Go study those who are indigenous peoples above the Arctic Circle. Go find some people living on remote Pacific islands or remote areas of the Amazon. Are they going to conceptualize things the same way? I mean, maybe. They too get hungry. They too get thirsty. There may be some things that they all have in common as human beings. But we shouldn't assume that at the outset. That's a question for anthropologists. And so Hegel says, really, when I think about how people organize experience, I don't find them all saying, oh yes, every event must have a cause. In fact, in the contemporary world, now that we've been exposed to quantum mechanics and the real possibility that some things just happen without cause, that at best they're statistical regularities at some level of reality. Not clear, by the way, that that's in the end how to interpret those theories, but it's a very plausible way to interpret them, and by now we're used to that thought. So we look at Kant or earlier philosophers saying, every event must have a cause, this is built into the structure of the mind, and we're inclined to say, well, no, it's not. I can entertain the possibility that's not true, that some things are truly random. What about other ideas, like the idea that the amount of matter in the world cannot be destroyed or expanded? Maybe, but maybe that's exactly what happens when we have an atomic explosion. We convert matter into energy. Maybe the amount of energy in the world remains constant. Our physical theory tells us that it is. On the other hand, I can imagine that it's not. So, in short, we're now thinking there are a lot of things that these philosophers thought it was impossible for us to entertain that we think we can entertain. Those things seem to change over time. Well, they do change, but Hegel says that doesn't mean that I want to end up as an absolute relativist who says, well, just the truth varies with time and place, or to become a skeptic who says, who knows who's right, we all approach the world differently, blah, blah, blah. Instead, he says, no. There are ways in which thought progresses. There are ways in which cultures progress. There are ways in which thinking progresses. And he calls that, in German, the term is Geist. In fact, his great work is the phenomenology of Geist. That is to say, of spirit or of mind, that progresses through stages toward absolute knowledge. Here, in talking about Geist, he doesn't mean just specifically your mind, or my mind. He really means thinking itself, The ways in which human beings approach the world, the way they think about the world, progress as human beings live in this world over time. It progresses toward absolute knowledge. He has hopes that we will finally reach it. Maybe it'll be a limit we will never really achieve. But in any case, that's what's happening. So it's not a random process. We aren't sitting there thinking, well, who knows who's right? He says, no, thinking is getting better and better. We're approaching the ultimate truth. But we could still be far away from it. So, what takes place as we progress through these stages? What really matters here is not how this set of people happens to see the world at this time. Instead, it's the dynamic principles that govern the development of thinking over time. If we have reason to think that we're going to eventually attain absolute knowledge of the world, well, it must be because we understand what's going on with these dynamic principles. So what can we say about that? Hegel says philosophy can express universal and necessary truths, but not of the kind that Kant thought. Not necessary and universal truths about the world, as he, or earlier Avicenna, or Descartes, or Leibniz, or other rationalists tried to sketch out. He says, not that kind of thing. You're looking for things that are constant across all times, places, cultures, historical periods, and so on. No, that's not it. I'm talking about the laws that govern the development of thought itself. So what we're going to be able to find as universal and necessary isn't anything about the world. It's about the development of thinking, okay? The dynamic principles that govern thought. There will not be a priori propositions about the world. There will not be innate concepts about the world. There will be these innate higher order abilities and tendencies of thinking that are going to allow us to articulate universal and necessary dynamic principles. So these are high-level dynamic principles, not about the world, but about our thinking about the world. They govern the development of thought. Hegel is thinking about thinking. He is thinking about our processes of cognition over time and the way we develop our theories, the way we approach the world, the concepts we use, and the ways in which they change in response to experience. He has a number of these dynamic principles. By far the most famous is what's become known as the Thesis, Antithesis, Synthesis pattern. And it is a common pattern, he thinks. He outlines this and the details of its development in a number of different ways. So he sees this happening again and again. Now, what is it? Well, let me use an analogy. Physics tries to give us some constant, universal, necessary, scientific laws. It looks at a world with things changing, but says nevertheless there's something that isn't changing. The laws according to which things are changing, they don't change. So the scientific laws are constant. The things in the world are changing. But we can say how. And that's what physics tries to do in laws of gravitation, laws of motion, laws governing electromagnetism, and in a variety of other ways. The theory of relativity does something similar. It looks at the qualities of things in the world, things like velocity, or motion, or even, well, gosh, mass, a variety of things that would have been taken to be primary qualities in the things themselves by Descartes and Locke. And it says, well, actually, those things change. They change across various reference frames. They're really relative to a reference frame. But the scientific laws, things like this is the speed of light, or like, well, momentum is inertial mass times velocity. Those are things that are invariant across reference frames. And so some scientific laws are invariant, no matter how we look at things, no matter whether we're moving or stationary and so on. But the qualities of things, including the primary qualities as traditionally understood, they do change across frames. Hegel's Historicism is doing something similar. It says our theories about the world, our basic concepts that we use about the world change. But there are dynamic principles about those concepts and theories that are constant. So he is looking at a changing set of things. In this case, not a changing world or a changing set of reference frames, but instead a changing set of theories about the world. And he's saying, I can formulate laws for how those theories change. And so if you look at a changing world here and then think of our theories as being one level up, trying to be constant, Hegel's looking and saying, yeah, but they're not very constant, are they? Look one level higher. That's where you get the constant theories about the way in which our thinking about the world changes. So if you might say an ordinary science of the world and traditional philosophies are looking at the world saying, we got a changing world, but maybe we can find some unchanging truths about it. Hegel says, I see a bunch of changing theories about those unchanging truths, but I can tell you how those theories are changing. And I'll come up with the only truly unchanging things one level higher, at the level of thinking, not about the world, but thinking about thinking. So here's his idea behind thesis, antithesis, synthesis. We start with a thesis. It transforms itself into an antithesis, or you might say it comes into conflict with an antithesis, and then out of that arises a synthesis. All of this can be presented in a way that makes it sound utterly mysterious and mystical, and some philosophers have rejected it that way. The African philosopher Quasi-Ruredu, for example, has looked at this saying, hey, these are just seemingly mystical laws. And insofar as Marx takes them over and builds them into the foundations of Marxism, there's similarly this mystical thing going on at the basis of Marxism. Well, turning here just to the Hegel part, forget Marx for a moment, we can say, I think he has in mind something that isn't quite as mystical as all of that. Here's the underlying idea. Suppose we are interested in mapping out the course of, well, in this case, the Colorado River, as it's going through southern Utah and headed toward the Grand Canyon. We find formations like this. And you can see here the river has been cutting through this rock over eons to make shapes like this, dramatic and beautiful scenery, but also has a bizarre and complex path as it goes through the rock. Well, suppose I'm trying to do this, and let's say there's a border between two counties that is supposed to follow the river, and I'm trying to chart where exactly this boundary is. Well, I am doing this using surveying tools that require me to use straight lines. In a certain sense, intuitively, we can say, look, it's in the center of that river, so it does go like this. But hey, come on, I'm supposed to be surveying this, right? And reporting coordinates, and I can't do curves like that. I have these things and I look through them and I do sight lines, and I need to reduce this to straight lines somehow. So how do I do it? Well, here's the idea. It's too complex, really, to be captured by any finite set of straight lines. So what I'm doing is approximating. And I approximate it first in this way. I try this line, this line, this line. But then you come back and you look and say, well, that's not quite right. I mean, come on, look, it's going over here, it's going over there. You're not really capturing the curve correctly. So we say there are inadequacies to that thesis. Let's try solving the problem. You've got this mistake here. Let's fix that. In fact, if we draw the thing differently in this way, start over here instead and try to map this, then we get something different. So here, in a grossly oversimplified form, over on the left there, I've got the thesis. Okay, we try drawing that line. And we say, well, wait a minute, that's not capturing this little oxbow thing going on here. And this little peninsula there, that's being left out, and so on and so forth. We say, this isn't quite right. So we draw a different line through this. And that I've got marked as the antithesis. But then the same thing happens there. We look and we say, well, now, yeah, you reported this, but now we've gone in our more detailed survey, and that's not quite right. I mean, that's not the center of the river here. It's cutting off all sorts of rock formations and so forth. So we synthesize them. We come up with something else. Now here I've drawn it as something halfway in between, roughly. But of course, that's not always the case. In fact, we might reconceptualize and say, you know, we need a totally different technique. This isn't going to do it at all. So the synthesis tries to combine the strengths of the thesis and antithesis, but sometimes is a compromise between them, often is a transcendence of them. And Hegel's term for this, they are aufgehoben, they are transformed, they are transcended by the synthesis. So it's not just a compromise, it's not just a blending or a combination. We somehow replace them with this new way of thinking about things. And ideally, it really is a transformation of the way we're thinking, not merely some compromise or combination. So here's the general pattern. People adopt a certain way of looking at and thinking about things. That's the thesis. But it's only partially correct. The world's a complicated place. It's not going to be totally right. So it faces contrary evidence. It faces counterexamples, anomalies, contradictions, problems emerge. And then we say, well, all right, we tried going with that hypothesis, and we encountered all sorts of problems. For a while, people try to solve the problems. And then they say, you know what, maybe we should have a new way of looking at things. And indeed, in science, this often happens. People are getting a theory, they're trying to develop the theory, they say, well, that's a problem case, this is a problem case, but we can solve it, we can solve this, we can solve this. And the theory becomes more and more complicated until finally somebody says, that's the wrong way to approach it. Why don't we start from this side instead? And so they come up with the antithesis. They shift to this new and contrary way of looking at things. But it's also only a partial truth. I mean, it's a new way of thinking about things in a sense. It denies the starting point of the other one and said, let's approach it from a different direction. But it too ends up facing contrary evidence, counterexamples, anomalies, contradictions. Again, the world's a complicated place. It doesn't get everything right. So eventually we realize we have to, in some way, combine the strengths of both and avoid the weaknesses of both. So we resolve the conflict between the thesis and the antithesis and transcend them in a new synthesis. It draws elements from both. It transforms how people think, how people see things, and it becomes a new thesis. But then the problem starts again. The process starts again. We begin thinking, oh yes, but now it is the new exciting idea. We go with it, and then it starts encountering anomalies, contradictions, counter-evidence, counter-examples. And now we say, well, what do we do about it? And the same thing happens. So thought keeps doing this. Hegel traces it through a number of things. You can see it happening in pre-Socratic philosophy, where we've got some people saying, there is one kind of thing at the foundation of the world, atoms. Somebody else, or sorry, one thing, water, that says Thales. Someone else says, no, there are different kinds of things. Air, water, fire. And then somebody else says, no, there are many, many different kinds of things, all these atoms, okay? And someone else, Heraclitus says, change is constant. Everything's just constantly changing. Parmenides says, nothing ever changes. Then Plato and Aristotle say, well, things change, but they remain the same thing across change. They change their accidental properties, but they retain their essential properties, and so forth. So these kinds of syntheses between opposing ideas keep happening. Well, Hegel says that's the general pattern of human thought. That just keeps happening. But notice that as it happens, you are trying to eliminate contrary evidence, counterexamples. You're getting your straight lines to approximate that curve more and more closely. So there's a sense in which you hope you're getting closer to the absolute truth. And he's confident that in the long run, we keep getting better and better at thinking about things as we do this. We do confront the counterexamples, the contrary evidence, the anomalies, the contradictions. And we do try to improve our ways of thinking that retains the explanatory power and the strength of our earlier theories. So in that way, our theories keep getting better and better. Who understood the physical world better? Aristotle in his physics or a contemporary physicist? Surely we hope the contemporary physicist, because all sorts of anomalies over centuries have been taken care of and are incorporated into the strength and power of that modern theory. Well, as we do this, we have to recognize that we're not doing this in a vacuum and we're not driven just by the world. We do this in a social and historical context. We frame our thinking and our theories in terms of language. Those linguistic units that we use, the words, the phrases, the ways in which we describe the world, are shaped by basic categories of thought, and they reveal the basic categories of our thinking. But other people at our time, or slightly earlier, other people in our context, in our circumstances, in our society, are teaching us language. So I think about the world in a certain way because I speak a certain language. I've learned that language from other people in a certain historical context. I think about the world, well, I know other languages, but I am a native speaker of English. That shapes how I see the world. And I learned that English within a particular social setting, given a certain interpretation of it. So what Hume attributed to custom or habit or feeling, what Kant and other rationalists attribute to a priori concepts and laws of reason, Hegel says, I see that as coming out of the social context, out of a particular place and time. Our thinking is shaped socially. It is really in society that we live and move and have our being. to steal a phrase from an ancient philosopher quoted famously by Paul in Acts 17. And so Hegel says, really, it is society playing that role. We learn our language and our ways of thinking in a given social and historical context. That shapes how we think everything. In particular, Hegel attacks the idea of a given. He attacks Kant's distinction between understanding and sensibility. He attacks the empiricist understanding of thinking as depending on sensation, impressions, and then ideas, and so on. He says, actually, no. Our perceptions of the world are shaped by our concepts from the very start. He is against what he calls immediacy, this idea that there is anything we contact in the world immediately. He says, even in a basic perception, I might think that this, looking at my hands, is just a basic perception. He says, but I'm already thinking of them as hands. I'm already conceptualizing them. How I perceive the world and the concepts I use to frame that perception are all part of one big process. It is not that sensibility does its thing, then the understanding does its, as Kant thinks. It's not the case that I have these impressions and then I form ideas. The ideas, the impressions, the sensations, the understanding, the conceptual resources, all of that is going on at the same time. There is no way to divide concepts from percepts, sensation from thinking about sensation, the concepts we use to understand sensations. Our concepts shape the way we perceive the world, and our perceptions are already thoroughly conceptual. If you don't give me the concepts, then I'm not going to perceive the world in the same way. I won't see things that really you might say, oh, look, the information is there. Why aren't you seeing it? Because I don't have the concepts to process it. And so he says there just is no given pre-conceptual portion of experience that we could isolate and call sensibility or sensation or impressions or anything else like that. The whole division on which rationalism and empiricism rest, that whole thing has to be rejected. Well, whatever I've said about concepts and perception in the world in general, thinking in general also applies to norms. Norms of ethics, but norms governing our behavior in all sorts of ways. We construct them. We construct them relative to a certain historical period and social context. Now, they do express the world spirit, Geist, in its current state of development. And so they are to be sneezed at, but on the other hand, they are relative to our time and place. In formulating principles of ethics, we are not formulating universal and necessary laws that stem from the laws of nature, as in natural law theory, or that stem from human nature and our responses to pleasure and pain, or happiness, or flourishing, or thriving, nor is there anything like a categorical imperative that applies to all rational beings. These are things that we formulate as useful guides for human life at a given time and place. Nevertheless, he says, we're not doing that arbitrarily. We are doing it because of the successes and failures of earlier systems of norms. And so these too are going to progress toward the absolute. And in fact, what we think about these things now, he says, is the best we can do now at understanding what that absolute is. So as a rather shocking conclusion, he says, whatever is right. Whatever is rational. This is as far as rationality has taken us at this point. And the best we can do is adopt the norms that are the most rational given our circumstances. So there's a sense in which whatever the ethical norms of our time and place are, they're the right norms for us to have at that time and place. That's not to say it's all purely relative. Tomorrow we may look at ourselves today and think we were barbarians. Nevertheless, he says, look, it was the best we could do at the time. And so in general, we think that norms too are relative to a time, relative to a place, but nevertheless have a kind of standing because they are putting us on the path and in fact are expressions of how far along we are on the path toward absolute knowledge of how to live.